This is John Lash recording for Course 5 in the Sophianic School of Arts and Sciences. That would be the course on metacritique. And as the subject for metacritique, by which I would demonstrate the method, I'm taking the work of Anatoly Fomenko. So the generic name for a projected series of talks to be presented on Nemitta and previewed on my YouTube channel, John Lamb Lash, is the Fomenko Follies. I'm going to begin with an introductory talk that focuses simply on the cover of the book, the cover of the first volume of Fomenko's 7-volume opus. And here you see an image of the cover. The text is available to members of nemitta.org. The link is in the description. Here you see a picture of the crucified Savior with a halo around his head, a familiar figure known to everyone in the world, whether you be of the Christian persuasion or not. But instead of being crucified on a cross, he's crucified on the face of a clock. So there's a message there. We'll look at what this message might entail at the end of this talk. And then there is the title, History, Fiction or Science, ? Now, you can't always tell a book by its cover, and I don't claim to have read the 7 volumes of Fomenko at this point. I've read the first volume. I've been over it a few times. And I will be looking into some of the other volumes in the near future as I proceed with this projected series of talks. For right now, I'm going to settle down in a chair, sit rather than stand. This is the first talk I'm recording in the new year 2019. I'd like to see if I can set a new mood and a new tone. If I'm standing here in this loft, I tend to move around a little, and that makes noise. It's an old loft, lost in the field of Flanders, and it tends to creak and moan like the captain's quarters in an old treasure galleon from time to time, especially when the northwest wind is blowing in, as it has been today. And with that said, let us begin. The cover, the title. Now I ask you to imagine that you're at a dinner party with someone. The attendants of the party are more or less intelligent people. They're not talking banalities. They're discussing matters that intelligent people discuss. And suppose someone turns to you and poses the question, what do you think about history and the writing of history? Do you think that it's science or fiction? Now suppose someone put that question to you across the dinner table. Completely disregard for a moment that question comes in the title of Fomenko's series. How would you respond without any knowledge of Fomenko, in total ignorance of his work? How would you respond to that question? Well, I'll tell you how I would respond immediately. I might reflect for a few seconds, but out of common sense, I would respond, well, it is neither. Of course, the conversation depends on how you define history. So in the written text that accompanies this talk, which is available to students of Nemitta, I've defined history in this way. A narrative composed in linear time from the study of research material, including first-hand testimony, as well as photographic, archaeological, cultural, linguistic, and textual evidence. Now, obviously, first-hand testimony of history can only come from people who are of a certain age. For instance, there are still people living today who, my oldest friend and best friend is one of them, who can remember the events of World War II. So such an individual would be able to provide first-hand testimonial evidence for something that happened 75 years ago or more. Additional to that kind of evidence, there is photographic, archaeological, cultural, linguistic, and textual evidence. And all of those materials constitute the body of history, the subject matter of history. And with that definition accepted, I think it's a definition that is easy to accept. History then can certainly not be considered as a science by any stretch of the term. History, or history writing, would be a patchwork of these different materials arranged in a certain manner into a storyline, fitting into a linear time frame. And such an exercise in narrative, constructing an historical narrative, does not resemble any kind of scientific activity whatsoever. It has nothing to do with the measurement of quantities or calculations of cause and effect due to physical forces and the properties of nature. Now, science, by a definition that I would suspect you can all agree upon, can all play along with, as Socrates said, you have to have provisional definitions at the beginning of a conversation. They're not absolute, they're just provisional tools so that you can get along with those definitions through the dialectic process and arrive at truths or conclusions or interpretations. So, hey, wouldn't you say that a provisional definition of science is that it involves the measurement and calculation of the properties of the natural world, including the behavior of living organisms? Thus, you can have a history of migrations of wild cranes of Eurasia. And that could be a scientific study. You can have a history of the migrations of the monarch butterfly up and down the west coast of the United States. And that history, as it were, that study, would fall into the genre of science. But when it comes to human history, you can't have that, because human history is not science. And the study and writing of human history is not a science and cannot be construed as a science. I argue, on the face of it, that to assert otherwise is simply absurd. So, I don't know how you may respond to the cover of Fomenko's books, but my first impression tells me that the man is off on the wrong foot from day one. Obviously, my view of Fomenko is highly critical, so I'm going to let you know, coming out of the gates, that I do not approve of or support the work of Anatoly Fomenko, and I do not endorse his new chronology. I find that there are some things to be learned from it. I'll do my best in the course of these talks on the Fomenko Follies to extract what can be learned, in my opinion. But I'm always transparent. I like to keep my pretenses right out in the open, and I'm not going to hide from anyone my opinion of Fomenko. So there you have it. Now, just a brief footnote here. You may well ask, well, if history, historiography, the writing of history, and the study of how history has been written, and all that to the full extent of the complete enchilada, is not science and cannot be science, or cannot be in the genre of science, to speak correctly, what genre would I place it in? Well, it belongs to the humanities. The preservation of history in the Western intellectual tradition, and in the intellectual tradition of any other country, nation, or civilization, such as China or India, belongs to the domain of the humanities, not to the domain of science. Now, I'd like to point out something really, that I consider to be really imperatively significant regarding Anatoly Fomenko. Let me read you his CV. Anatoly Fomenko, born 1945, full member academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences, full member of the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences, full member of the International Higher Education Academy of Sciences, Doctor of Physics and Mathematics, professor, head of the Moscow State University section of Mathematics of the Department of Mathematics and Mechanics. Okay, I'll stop at that point. The paragraph goes on. You can read it on the first page of his book. One thing you need to bear in mind, my friends, is that Anatoly Fomenko is no outsider as far as Russia is concerned. As far as the Russian scientific and intellectual establishment is concerned, he's a total insider. Now, he may appear to the West because he challenges the calendric system developed in the West by Scaliger and Petavius, because he challenges the Julian and Gregorian calendric system. He may appear as a rebel and an outsider. He is anything but. Anatoly Fomenko comes from the heart and core of the Russian establishment, and I'm going to use the word Soviet. He comes out of the Soviet establishment and the Soviet mindset. And I would just point out to you that one of the objectives of the Soviet, i.e. Marxist agenda for society, is to demolish entirely the humanities and to rewrite history so that it accords with Marxist ideology. Please be warned, and I don't often use the word please, but in this case I make an exception. Please be warned of where Fomenko's work is coming from. The Soviet intention to rewrite history goes back to the origins of Marxism and the intention of Marxist Soviet ideologues and their successors, that is to say, the ideologues of cultural Marxism, who have been so successful in implementing their program in the United States and in Europe, all share the same intention, which is to destroy the humanities. History belongs to the genre of the humanities, not to the genre of science. Be warned. That said, let's return to Fomenko's primary claim. Fomenko makes quite a number of claims. The primary claim is that history, the composition of an historical narrative in linear time, can be treated and ought to be treated as a mathematical science. So history should be developed by mathematical methods, and he demonstrates in his 7 volumes how he does so. Well, hey, come on, hold on here. Just a minute. It is true. Obviously, common sense can tell you this, that any historical narrative based on any chronology constructed in linear time requires arithmetic, counting dates, adding and subtracting the intervals between dates. For instance, what is the interval between the French Revolution and now, coming forward from then? What is the interval between the end of the Roman Empire and the French Revolution, going back into the past and coming forward from the end of the Roman Empire. That's simple arithmetic. Arithmetic, not mathematics, and certainly not complex formulas or algorithms, such as you see demonstrated in the work of Fomenko, is all it takes to construct an historical narrative in linear time. Excuse me, what kind of bill of goods is Fomenko presenting here? And what is he actually delivering? I assert that any reliable chronological timeline of history can be developed using more or less basic grade school mathematics, grade school arithmetic. It does not require complex formulas and algorithms. So, to continue, chronology can be, and indeed is, a science, especially the chronology based on astronomical events, such as eclipses, and the cycles of planets, such as the periodic conjunctions of the outermost planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, or the periodic conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter, which are visible. The study of the periodic conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter is a huge topic in the field of historical chronology in European history and in the history of other cultures as well. There's nothing mysterious or particularly difficult about any of this. Now, the discussion of Fomenko brings us into an area, you and I, into an area which happens to be an area of my expertise, or I should say, of my expertise. So, there you go. I've done an enormous amount of work, and I have published and unpublished work on the world ages, the study of the precession of the equinoxes, and the study of what Dane Rudhyar called eonics, that is to say, patterns of historical events plotted against astronomical events. I have notebooks and notebooks of material delving into this area of study. One of the things that I can tell you is that constructing a timeline to fit historical events, a timeline to plot historical events, is not a matter of abracadabra. It's not something that requires a professor of mathematics and mechanics from Moscow University to accomplish. It's been accomplished many, many times in the past. I've done it myself. And I've studied the many cultures, Chinese, Tibetan, Indian, Egyptian, Maya, Aztec, Persian, who have accomplished the same exercise in plotting historical events according to their correlation to astronomical events. You could do it yourself today. If you want to create your own calendar system, take the solar eclipse of, what was it, January 6th, 2018. No, 2019, excuse me. Just a few days ago. Take that eclipse and calculate back in time or ahead in time from that eclipse. You can construct an entire calendric system based on the calculable astronomical events, eclipses, comets, planetary conjunctions, and so forth. And then you can plot a parallel timeline of historical events, and presto, abracadabra, you have your own private version of the equivalent of Fomenko's new chronology. It's nothing mysterious. It's been done dozens of times. In the text that accompanies this talk, I show an example taken from the calendric system of Guatemala. Various ancient civilizations have constructed calendric systems proven to be of high sophistication and accuracy. The Maya, for example, excelled in chronological science, and they commemorated events on elaborate stone pillars called stela, or stele, plural, S-T-E-L-A. Maybe it's stela. Yeah, I think it's stela. So you see, I provide an example of a very well-known and much-studied stela, known as Stela D from Quirigua in Guatemala. And what do you see on this stela? The photograph I provide only shows a section of it. Well, you see primarily two things. You see first engraved illustrations that represent events in the history of the Maya people, and in particular in the history of the reign of a tribal lord named Kawak Sky. And so there are illustrations on the pillar of events in his reign. Additionally, there is the typical dot and bar system of Maya calendrics, which gives a date for the conclusion of the reign of this particular tribal lord. That date, according to the dot and bar system, is 9.16.15.0.0, which equates, according to the experts in Maya chronology, to the 17th of February, 766 AD. Now that is a date in the chronology of Scaliger and Petavius, which is the conventional chronology used by historians today. But Fomenko disputes the chronology of Scaliger and Petavius and refutes it and proposes to substitute in its place a new chronology based on his mathematical methods. So that, in a nutshell, is the intention or goal or objective of Anatoly Fomenko. But not just that. Not just that. As I intend to show in this series of talks, the agenda carried in Fomenko's work involves far more than merely the proposal of another timeline, an alternative timeline. But I won't get into that right now. I'll return to the very great fact, which is known to anyone who's delved into the subject matter, and I've delved into it for well over 50 years, that there exists, derived from ancient civilizations, a great number, well, not a great number, but let's say 8 or 10 significantly known and recorded chronological timelines, just as you see illustrated here in Stela D from Quirigua in Guatemala. It's a brilliant example. So, what Fomenko is undertaking is nothing new. From the viewpoint of metacritique, or the higher criticism, and the deconstructive criticism of historical narratives and belief systems, that is metacritique, the challenge here is to look at what is his belief system, what does he think he's doing, and where is he coming from, and what kind of agenda is he proposing. But that is the matter of forthcoming talks. So for right now, let's just return to my main point. The Mayan stela is an example of precise historical chronology. Nevertheless, the event commemorated, which is the end of the reign of a certain tribal king in 766 AD, can never be reduced to a scientific analysis. How could you ever do so? It's only a story. He may never even have existed, or he may be a composite of different people. What is the evidence? What is the historical evidence? Historical evidence is not amenable to scientific analysis. Events experienced by human beings and actions undertaken by them over time are not like processes of nature that can be converted into mathematical laws. Isn't that just common sense? If it is, then I would submit that in that respect, Fomenko's entire program defies common sense. Also, I'd like to warn you in this first talk leading into the subject that there's kind of a bait and switch phenomenon happening with Fomenko. Bait and switch is a term for marketing. It refers to the tactic in which the owner of a store will put a certain model of a toaster in the window of the store and announce it at a certain price. That's the bait. But when the customer goes inside, they end up being sold a different model at a different price. That's the switch. And generally, the objective of that tactic is to rip off the customer. I would advise that there is definitely a bait and switch tactic happening with Fomenko's work. On the face of it, he simply proposes a new chronology. What is that? Well, to be honest, to keep it strictly within the limits of a workable definition, a new chronology is simply a new way of dating events. But that's not what you get from Fomenko. No way. What you get is a complete rewrite of events. Now, I could accept that Fomenko would present his version, his option, for a new chronology. The Maya had a chronology, the Aztecs, the ancient Hindus, the Egyptians. I've studied and correlated and compared all these chronologies in depth. I can accept that Fomenko might propose an optional or alternative chronology. But doing so is a deed unto itself. It's an exercise that stands on its own. It's a stand-alone proposal. But Fomenko, as we'll see in this course of my commentaries, doesn't do that. You know, have you ever seen pictures of those trucks that the Soviets use in Siberia to do earthworks? These monster trucks, they seem to be 4 or 5 stories high and a couple of city blocks long, and the tires are 10 feet high. Imagine a bulldozer of Soviet proportions. That's what you get with the work of Fomenko. I warn you, he's not just proposing a new timeline. He's proposing to come in with a Soviet-style, industrial-style monster bulldozer and completely plow under most of the historical narratives that support the history and culture of the world, but particularly of the European West. He intends to completely plow under a number of historical narratives, proving them to be forgeries or substitutions derived from other events. So, for instance, he claims that the events described in the Hebrew Old Testament supposed to have happened between 1800 BC and, say, 400 BC, actually occurred in the Middle Ages. This is a major event of historical bulldozing. So be aware and be prepared and be cautious of what's coming your way if you delve into the work of Anatoly Fomenko. Now, to continue and conclude my study, I have some notes here in the text on Nemitta, which I won't go over now in order not to extend this talk. I just will point out that the ideal and universally applicable method for constructing as an historical timeline uses astronomical dating. Eclipses, comets, other celestial phenomena. Historical and astronomical events can then be correlated Now, historical chronology based on astronomical timing is the simple, single, and reliable testing pattern for construction of an historical narrative. And I have extensively demonstrated that method in my work, mostly in my unpublished work. Fomenko uses astronomical dating, eclipses, comets, etc., but in my humble opinion, he uses it badly, he uses it wrongly, he distorts it, he draws false conclusions, and worse. Yeah, worse. I would say he concocts enormous fabrications and fabulations based upon his mishandling of the astronomical material. Of course, that's the big issue. That's a huge argument. And I must reserve my comments and exposition on those matters to future talks in this series. Anyway, bear in mind that astronomical chronology is one of my specialties. So in that respect, I feel confident in commenting on Fomenko because he's playing in my sandbox. Okay, to go to the second part of the question implied in the subtitle of his book. Well, is history fiction? What answer would I give over a dinner party conversation? I'd say yes and no. I'd give a qualified answer. Even more qualified. I'd say no and yes. No, history is not fiction, insofar as it is intended to be an accurate account of verifiable facts using evidence that can be verified by materials, by research materials. But yes, hold on, yes, history resembles a fiction in that it is ultimately a narrative construct created by the human mind in the attempt to reconstruct events in the past. History is the art of storytelling based on facts and evidence, and good history is history that is based on verifiable facts and evidence. Bad history is history that simply fabricates evidence, ignores evidence, or develops a narrative which disregards evidence. Some of you who followed the Gnostic investigation of the Mandela effect on my YouTube channel, which is now closed, might recall that I began by raising a question. I did it in the form of a kind of test, which I called the PsyQ test, instead of the IQ test. The purpose of this test was to see if I could confirm, regarding the historical narrative of the life of Nelson Mandela, if a certain study was correct. I heard about a certain study, or I believe it was several studies, which concluded that in the world today, only 1 out of every 10 people will allow their viewpoint to be changed by the facts. To put it another way, only 1 in 10 people cares about the facts and evidence that support any viewpoint or narrative or interpretation. They just go with a narrative or interpretation, with the rhetoric or the agenda, regardless of the facts that may support it or that may refute it. This appears to be an established fact based on statistical studies. I actually would rank it much lower than that. I would say that possibly 5 people in 100 care about knowing the facts and evidence in any instance. For instance, the instance of an historical narrative such as World War II. Who cares about the actual facts and evidence upon which the narrative of World War II can be constructed? Well, as far as I can tell, 5 out of 100 people, and probably less, care about that. So, the fact is that the probative faculty of the human animal is extremely damaged in our time. Probative meaning the faculty by which you prove to yourself the truth or falsity of a statement by evidence, by gathering evidence, building that evidence into a proof structure, and arriving at a conclusion based on the evidence, proving that the narrative is true, proving that the narrative is false. Unfortunately, the willingness to do that and the capacity to do that in our time has been lost. And there are very, very few people who care to do that or who can do that in our time. So, that said, we're turning to the second point of my exposition here. What exactly is Fomenko getting at in the title of this book? The series, actually. Is he suggesting by the title, well, what do you want history to be? What do you consider it to be? Do you consider it to be a science? Or do you consider it to be fiction? And it would appear that he's opposing those two viewpoints. He's setting out a dichotomy. And if you look at where his work goes, how he develops his premises and his method, then I think you'd have to conclude that he believes that history is a science and that it's not fiction. But actually it's neither a science or fiction. But the writing of history has some factors in common with the writing of fiction. Case in point, let me ask you, the listener right now, whoever you may be, what would happen to you if you read 4 different histories of the Russo-Japanese War? Question mark. The Russo-Japanese War. Have you ever heard of the Russo-Japanese War, which occurred around 1905? What were the causes of the war? Who was involved in the war? What were the actual confrontations, the battles? Who led those battles and why? What was the outcome of the war? What was the knowledge held by the world at large about the war at the time that the war happened? What have been the various interpretations of the significance of that war since it did happen? Well, questions like that would come up, and others as well, if you took an interest in the Russo-Japanese War. And in order to know anything about it, you would have to go to historians who have written about it. There is a factor of trust involved there. Are the historians trustworthy or not? Big question. Take another example. What about the foundations of South Africa? What about the beginnings or origins of the colonization of South Africa? What do you know about that story? Can you imagine that there's a version of that story that claims that the white colonialist came in and mercilessly slaughtered and displaced the peaceful and loving African native tribes who were living there in Edenic conditions at that time? How would you like that narrative? Would you eat that up with your evening meal and swallow it uncritically? There are many people who would like you to do so. There are other people who would say that the area of South Africa settled by the colonialists from Europe, principally Dutch, was uninhabited, and they didn't invade or commit genocide on anyone. As a matter of fact, the scarce sparse and scarce nomadic tribes that were living in that region at the time used to routinely commit genocide on each other. There's another narrative. Which one are you going to believe? Well, if your probative faculty is still operating, then you're going to decide that question based on the evidence and the facts. But you then have to go looking for the evidence and the facts, don't you? So, again, third example. What do you know about the discovery of the Northwest Passage? Do you even know what the Northwest Passage is? If you were to go investigate it, you would find various versions of the story. All historical accounts place before those who examined them the challenge to evaluate how they are written and to evaluate whether or not they are supported by evidence, or even if there is evidence to support them in the first place. It's a very difficult, tricky, and extremely demanding area of human inquiry, isn't it? Anyone can see that. And obviously not everyone is going to have the time to investigate these matters in depth. The final point I want to make as we come around to the image on the cover of Fomenko's series is a point I've already made with a warning, and I want to restate it. Fomenko uses mathematical algorithms to discover patterns in different historical accounts. He quantifies historical accounts taken from written documents and compares them according to a series of 30 or 40 notations that he extrapolates into a graph. In other words, he makes a graph, for example, of the history of the Crusades, and then he makes a graph of the account of certain things that happened in the Old Testament. Then, once he has plotted these events by a quantitative and scientific method, correction, he does not plot the events, he plots different textual chronicles and historical accounts of these events on graphs. And then he compares these graphs. And the graphs have a remarkable similarity, the graph profiles. Now, I will explain in a future talk exactly why this happens. And I'll do my best to show you that Fomenko has indeed discovered something with his mathematical algorithmic deciphering of historical and chronological narratives. Indeed, but it's not what he thinks he's discovered. But for now, just let me say that his discovery of those different historical accounts generating or generated from the same mathematical profiles led him to conclude that the various accounts coming from different cultures are fictitious or forged versions of one single authentic event. And he claims to identify the single authentic event and, by extension, to expose the forgeries or fabrications constructed around that event. If you get what I'm saying, you can easily see that Fomenko goes a long, long way from simply constructing an alternative chronological timeline. He's driving one very massive, turbo-powered Soviet bulldozer. But he's just sitting in the driver's seat. He's not necessarily the one who plots the course for that bulldozer. So in conclusion, let's take a look at the cover image. The figure of the crucified Savior with a halo stretched across the face of a clock. The halo suggests that Anatoly Fomenko and his collaborators do regard the figure of Jesus Christ as a divine or sacred personage, a character of a non-ordinary quality. Possibly they accept the Orthodox Christian view, which is held by both the Western Church and the Greek Orthodox Church in Russia, that Jesus was the only begotten Son of God and was sent by God as the Savior of humanity. I haven't delved into Fomenko's work to the point where I can confirm that. Nevertheless, there is the numinous image of the crucified Savior on the cover of his book, but he's not crucified on a cross. He's crucified on a clock. How bizarre is that? On the face of a clock. Well, you get the message by now. The timeline of the calendric system that Fomenko proposes to overthrow, which I will call the Scaliger-Petavius timeline, or SP timeline, uses the life of Christ, or the birth and crucifixion of Jesus Christ, as the pivotal date in the timeline. Every timeline has to have a pivotal date where the counting begins. For instance, as I said earlier, you could go back to the eclipse, the solar eclipse of a few days ago, January 2019, and you could make that the pivotal event of a calendar, and then you could calculate back into the past from that moment. You could make that the year zero and go back to -1, -2, -200, -2000, and likewise you could go ahead. It is entirely arbitrary, and it has been done in quite a few different ways, quite a few times, in different civilizations of the past. Some of them, like the Maya and Aztecs, and the Hindus, have constructed their chronological system with jaw-dropping accuracy in regard to the astronomical events that would confirm the sequence of linear time. It remains to be seen if Fomenko's new chronology is as good as anything that the Maya produced or the ancient Egyptians produced. I would like to see that. I would like to see him prove that. The difference, however, between the calendric system or new chronology of Fomenko and the Maya, Aztec, Egyptian, and Hindu systems, which I have studied closely in the presentation of my work on the Dendera zodiac, the difference is that those systems are not Christocentric. So one thing I would have you observe about Fomenko, as I bring this talk to its conclusion, is that even though Fomenko refutes and wishes to overthrow the SP timeline, the Scaliger-Petavius timeline, that timeline is pinned on dates associated with the figure of Jesus Christ, and so is the timeline of Anatoly Fomenko. Now, what do you make of that? Fomenko claims, and you find this in the note that opens up his book, that the accounts of the life of Jesus, presumed to be the Yehudi Savior, who later became the Redeemer of the Christian faith, the life of Jesus is as found in the Bible, in the New Testament, is a set of fabrications based on or drawn from or derived in some manner from one actual historical person who lived from 1121 to 1185 in Europe. Here you encounter the 1,000-year increment of phantom time or gap in time that is typical of Fomenko's work. It's not exactly 1,000 years. It tends to vary from 800 to 1,000 to 1,200, even up to 1,400. It's a shifting window. The point is, Fomenko argues that you can take out about 1,000 years of history as we know it, that it never really happened, and you can collapse time so that events which were said to have happened 2,000 years ago during the life of Jesus actually happened about 1,000 years ago. Coming down to the close of the Middle Ages, but still, presumably, in the life of Jesus, in some manner. So what role does Jesus / Christ / the Savior, the Son of God, the Redeemer, what does that figure have to do with the new chronology? Well, I really don't know, because I have not yet found a passage in Fomenko or in any commentaries on Fomenko which explicitly reveals how Fomenko and his collaborators regard the figure of Jesus Christ. I'm inclined to believe, if you can judge a book by its cover, that Fomenko maintains that a character who has come to be known as Jesus Christ actually lived 1,000 years later in time, that is 1,000 years closer to us now than we are accustomed to think, according to the history or historical time frame of the Bible. I'm inclined to think that he believes and asserts that such a character existed. What significance does he give to his version of Jesus Christ? I don't know. And I am eager to find out, and I will be happy to report to you all when I do find out. But for right now, in closing this talk, I'd like to ask you this question. If the ancient Egyptians, the Hindus with their yugas, if the Maya and the Aztec peoples, and the ancient Chinese chronographers and skywatchers attached to the court of the emperor, such as the great Yellow Emperor of China, if those ancient sages, known to have been experts in skywatching, and that includes the Gnostics, you can believe it, produced a system of historical chronology that parallels astronomical events and therefore can be tracked mathematically, that excluded Jesus Christ and that did not rely upon the supposed dating of the life of Jesus Christ as the definitive date for their calendar. If they could do that, then why construct a calendar centered on the chronology of the life of Jesus Christ, if you can do without it? I certainly would prefer to do without it. I think one of the greatest distortions of history, in fact, lies right there. That the historical timeline is AD BC, Anno Domini, or before Christ. Is it conceivable to construct another timeline that isn't pinned on that date? Absolutely. Absolutely. You could construct half a dozen of them. What about Fomenko's timeline? Is it pinned on that date? Well, I don't know, but why does he display the conventional image of the tortured Redeemer crucified on the face of a clock? I really don't know. I will do what I can to find out, and I'll get back to you and report on that in the future, in the time to come, to the best of my ability, and God is willing. As a closing remark, I just want to bring to your attention something that may be known to many of you already, is certainly known to hundreds and thousands, if not millions of people on the internet, namely, that the narrative of the life of Jesus Christ as found in the Old Testament is a complete fiction. It's a complete fabrication. Now, scholars dating back to the middle of the 19th century, such as Renan and others, R-E-N-A-N, have made the case for the fabulation of Jesus. And I've written a lot about that, and there are units concerning that issue which have migrated from metahistory.org into the courses on Nemata. You may have heard the case about the Flavian family, including Josephus Flavius, who was a Jewish Roman historian. And there is a huge case supported by a lot of evidence that the gospel narratives of Jesus were pure fabrications coming from the Flavian family, and that they were constructed for political reasons, just like the narratives you hear on the mainstream media today, which are completely deceitful, not based on evidence, and intended to deceive and mislead. They are constructions, fake news, constructions, in order to mislead the populace. Likewise, the good news of the Christian Gospels is fake news, and this has been proven from many different angles. I have my own way of deconstructing the story of Jesus from the Gnostic viewpoint. So yeah, tell it like it is. Considering the enormous amount of work over 150 years that has gone into deconstructing the Jesus/Christ narrative and showing that the supernatural claims and powers attached to that entity are total make-believe. What's Fomenko going to do? What's he going to do now? Fomenko or his handlers, his Soviet handlers, what are they going to do? Steer you straight back into that narrative? Except that they're going to pluck Jesus Christ and the incidents of his life out of a time slot located 2,000 years ago and place them in the 12th century. You going to buy that? You going to go for that? That's what's coming down the road when you give your credibility to the work of Anatoly Fomenko. So buyer beware, and reader beware, and truth seeker beware. And I have more to say and more to deconstruct and analyze, a lot more obviously, in the course of this series on the Fomenko Follies. But I'll leave it at that for now. And until the next time, I'll be seeing you in the sacred groves.